Mama Kodo. Written by John H. Thompson. Narrated by Sherelle Palmer. Chapter 1. The absolute silence was broken only by the brief, occasional whine of a gnat and the faint, distant hiss of leaves waving in the tops of the trees, stirred by a lazy breath of wind. Spring was rapidly aging away into the summer, and the black pavement was preparing for long months of slow, steady cooking under the blazing sun. On this morning, the bright yellow ball of fire that lit the world seemed to slide behind the smoothly slipping clouds, casting wide shadows that rolled over the earth, breaking its heated fury, muting it to occasional peaks between the threatened overcast. Mama Kodo moved slowly, her short, heavy bent body rocking from side to side with each measured step. The large burlap bag loaded with the cans of vegetables she had just purchased in the convenience store a mile back up the lonely country road pulled on her arm, providing a counterweight to the crude walking stick that bit into the loose gravel at the edge of the asphalt with every lumbering step. Her appearance seemed to sit on the razor's edge between startling and unnoticeable. The hem of her thick, dark, worn skirt seemed to collect the grayish-brown dust kicked up by each shuffling step of her heavy, scuffed work boots. The blouse hung loose as it thoughtlessly donned, and every few steps she had to raise the gnarled black walking stick to pull the knitted shawl back up as it slipped slowly down her rounded, elderly shoulders, or reach up beneath the wide, crude straw hat brim and gather a bead of sweat from her forehead unto her fingertip, before it cascaded down into her eyes. Her ancient, weathered, heavy, coal-black face glistened with a steady sheen of perspiration, and her thick, pink lips puffed out with each exhaled breath as she moved steadily along the side of the winding road. She stopped to switch the heavy burlap bag containing her few purchases to the other hand, replacing it with the cane and taking a moment to glance ahead with amazingly sharp brown eyes. Beyond the next dip in the road, just where it passed between the thick copse of pines 100 yards further along, she would turn down the dirt path, leaving this last vestige of human presence and re-entering the woods. The path ended another mile or so along in the wide abandoned field of tall grass, bordered on its far side by the old rusted barbed wire fence, its bottom strand long since cut. On the far side of the fence would be the drop-off that led down over jutting rocks, through gnarled trees to the edge of the thick boggy swamp that stretched away into a murky darkness, cloaked in overgrown trees. She would follow the edge of the soggy bottom ground off to the left until it rose slightly to dry, wooded ground, amid whose impressive, towering fingers her crude cabin nested. She would be home in another hour or so, she told herself, her necessary trek to purchase the few supplies she required to sustain herself, completed for another week. She took advantage of being stopped momentarily to cast her gaze up at the lowering sky. Gonna rain tonight, she thought. Rain cats and dogs. Those were wet clouds coming in from the west, and with them they would bring lightning and thunder. Someone was going to die tonight, she thought. No, 2 folks. On this here very road, thrown into the air like busted rag dolls when the big old car skid sideways. Not 100 paces from this very spot, and went to flipping over and over, coming to rest on his top side. 2 young folks, nice young folks. Pity about that, she mused. Real pity. She began moving once more, her rolling, lumbering gait taking on its steady rhythm with every step. In a few minutes, she passed by the tall, weathered road sign, proclaiming that this dark ribbon of tar was officially designated as North Carolina State Highway 321. A gnat buzzed by her ear, adding its tiny squeak to the slow, unbroken crunch of her boots and the loose gravel of the roadside. This here was turning out to be a real fine Saturday, she told herself. Real fine. Except for them young folks who was going to die tonight in the midst of that rain. But it wasn't her job to stop that from happening. No, sir. It was decreed, and what is decreed must be done. She'd long ago given up trying to meddle in such things. It never worked out anyway. Oh, there were things she could do. Many things. But changing one of them things what was to be wasn't one of them. Them meant to be things was beyond her power to even touch. Mostly all she could do was help them that was meant to be come to pass. That was all. Far behind her, she heard the odd rushing sound of the approaching car. It sounded big, she thought, like one of them pickup trucks, coming on fast and hard out of town. Probably heading toward Lincolnville some 12 miles ahead. Young man driving, she thought, and young man riding as well. Foolish boys. She didn't bother to slow her pace or ease her way off from the crude edge of the pavement. There was no need. Even as the sound grew louder behind her, the sadness came over her. Some folks just don't know how to do right, she thought. The sound of the tires biting hard into the asphalt was joined by the quickly building hum of the engine, racing up behind her. It was almost here, she told herself. Then came the horn, loud and blaring, as the engine built to a thunderous roar and the dark red form of the pickup went rocketing by her, the faint shouted voice riding atop the cascade of mechanical sounds. "The hell out the way, nigger!" The young man's voice yelled from beside her, already fading as the pickup roared by, coming now into her field of vision, blasting away down the road toward the distant gentle hill it had to crest before it disappeared from view entirely. She watched it recede ahead of her, shrinking as it added distance between itself and her. Should she? She asked herself, or just let it go? No, she decided. There was a lesson needed teaching, and if not a lesson, then at least a little punishment. Yes, she thought, just a little punishment, even if the young fools never knew what it was for. And it was a small thing, barely noticeable in that other place. She wouldn't even need a stone to do it. It was so tiny in the overall scheme of the world. She fixed her gaze on the rear of the rapidly receding pickup, watching it enter the dip and begin its climb up the slope toward the low crest, dragging its roaring engine noise behind it. Just as it leveled out at the height of the crest, she flicked out her thick pink tongue to moisten her lips and whispered, "Pop." She did not hear the sound of the tire bursting on the left front of the pickup, but the sound of the squealing brakes came to her faintly, the vehicle suddenly slewing almost sideways as it started down the other side of the low hill and disappeared from view. She smiled to herself, knowing that they had no spare. Just as quickly the smile froze and then died. No, she thought, don't take no pride in it. Not now. That'd make it worth noticing that other place. And you ain't ready. And you ain't got no stone. And you know how bad it is to do anything without the stone. So just behave yourself, old woman. She continued her slow, steady, lumbering pace down into the dip, savoring a faint, cool breeze that brushed against her warm face, chilling the tiny beads of sweat, and reached up to tug her slipping shawl up onto her shoulders once more. Just as she reached the spot where the dirt path cut away from the meandering two-lane country road, she glanced up to see one of the young men coming back over the crest of the low hill ahead. Nope, she told herself, no spare. Well, he gets what you deserves. In this case, a long walk back to town, and a whole day wasted. She left the road, directing her feet into the two deep ruts in the dirt that cut between the thick trees, and headed off home. Just before she passed between the tall stand of pines, she considered for a moment if maybe it would be best for the rain to come now. Wouldn't that make the punishment even more suitable? No, she decided. Vengeance was not in her heart. Only balance. Only things as they should be. By the time the two young men muttering angry curses passed by the opening in the trees containing the dirt road, the driver's mind still absorbed in trying to figure out how he was going to pay for a brand new tire. His glance over to where she turned off the asphalt revealed nothing. She was already out of sight amid the trees. Mama Kodo was heading home again. Most of the citizens of Drum's Crossroad never really knew where the name came from, or when the collection of buildings that made up the town first came to be known by it. As far as they were concerned, it was simply the place where they had been born, grown up, and where many of them had spent much of their lives. From time to time, the small local weekly newspaper would vaguely mention the town's location as once having had a certain significance during the darker days of the American Revolution. Scattered ragtag colonial forces had used it as a gathering point before marching over the border into South Carolina, which was less than a day's walk away, and engaging the British regulars at the Battle of Cowpens. Those with time to kill and nothing more interesting to turn their minds to would idly speculate that the sound of the militia's drumbeats converging at this place, at that time little more than an open meadow, was the most likely explanation for the name that was chosen when the town was finally cobbled into being into the late 19th century. But nobody knew for sure, and fewer bothered to ponder the question. They knew that it wasn't much as towns go, certainly nothing at all compared to Ashcroft or Bentonville, or even Crawford City. For most it was simply home, and that was enough. They had grown comfortable and familiar with it, memorized its feel, gotten used to the locations of all the places they needed to go for their shopping or church or of the other mundane, ordinary aspects of their lives, and they were quite at home with that. As towns went, it was enough. The single line of the old Southern Railroad, laid down just prior to that terrible trouble between the country's two contesting regions, and now abandoned for many years, cut through the town, paralleling the main street in a low gully that ran beside the crest on which the center of the community had been built, though the station at the far western edge of the downtown area had long since been converted into a small furniture store, owned by old Mr. Potter before he had his stroke. Now it stood boarded up, its cracked asphalt parking lot slowly being infested by tall clumps of weeds. The railroad had caused the town to come into being. This was tobacco country, and the large farms on which the wide majestic leaves were grown spread out in all directions for miles. Placing the official stop beside the wandering dirt road that existed at that time made it a convenient place for the large wagons to come from all over the county, bearing their bulging bales of burlap-wrapped tobacco. These were loaded onto the massive boxcars and hauled away toward the coast, where they would be shifted onto various steamships bound for the rest of the world. The most fortunate beneficiary of this particular ribbon of iron rails was Cyrus Walker, owner of the vast rambling spread that lay just beyond where the front gate of his sprawling property joined the wide, hard-packed dirt road toward destinations east and west. Over time, various merchants had decided that their businesses might flourish if their shops were close by the small station, allowing the farmers to load their empty wagons with a variety of goods and wares, and give them somewhere to spend the money they'd received from the ever-present railroad agent for the sale of their raw product. By the last decade of the 19th century, there was the crude beginnings of an actual town spread out on the dusty road that ran alongside the tracks, its red clay fingers branching off throughout the county. An actual community of sorts had begun to nestle itself on a short road at the top of a low crest that ran parallel to the tracks, some 100 yards distant, with the first houses to take root in the area. Some of the hopeful home builders even tried to mimic, as best they could, the stately style of the big house that formed the centerpiece of the Walker plantation, that stood deeply back beyond the thick trees across from the door of the train station. But time moves along, bringing its constant changes, and with the coming of the first automobiles and trucks, the farmers found they could make better profits by taking their goods directly to other markets themselves. By the time the dirt road beside the tracks was abandoned, and the parallel road at the top of the gentle crest took over as the main thoroughfare between the thriving mill city of Gastonia to the east and the cozy hamlet of Shelby to the west, it was lined with flourishing businesses and small but ornate brick buildings, and the need for the railroad was already slipping away. Eventually the tracks were abandoned altogether and left to rot and overgrow with thick weeds, becoming a sort of rusty ghost that peeked from the earth here and there at the bottom of an oddly regular-looking ditch that ran along beside the town. As the sun coursed through the sky on that lazy spring afternoon, the town of Drum's Crossroad had long since settled into a slow, languid state of decay. Even Cyrus Walker, having come to hard times in the wake of that destructive conflict that had overturned the nature of the world, moved out to attempt other opportunities elsewhere, never returning. The property had begun to decay, leaving only the confused former slaves, now trying to accept their new status as people, still clinging to their meager rough shacks, arrayed in the wide field behind the Walker Mansion big house, remained, where the descendants of some had remained ever since. The movie theater, located toward one end of Main Street, now only ran shows on the weekends, weekday evenings having been taken over by the televisions most everyone now possessed. The Home Folks Cafe, 3 blocks down toward the Central Bank building with its large ornate clock, had begun to close at 6 in the evening, no longer bothering to make itself available to those few potential customers who might find the need to eat without the bother of cooking for themselves. Now there was a brand new hamburger stand a few blocks over, where the main highway bypassed the little downtown, to see to their needs as late as 10 o'clock every night of the week. The drugstore, across the street from the squat City Hall building, still had its soda counter, but it sold more bottles than fountain drinks, and Mr. Hauser, nearing retirement, was even thinking of simply putting in a dispensing machine instead. A 10-minute walk at a leisurely pace would carry anyone from one end of the downtown to the other, past the barber shop, the Western Auto, the clothing store, and all the various other little shops, some of them struggling to survive in this 66th year of the 20th century. Times were changing, and not all the changes were welcomed by the stoic citizens of Drum's Crossroad. The finishing touches were being put on the new strip mall down by the new service station at the junction of Elm Street and Richard Roads. It was even said that once the Winn-Dixie supermarket opened its doors, no one would waste their time stopping by old Mr. Crowder's grocery over on Pine Avenue. Prices would be much cheaper at the Winn-Dixie, people said. And right next door would be a dry cleaner's and a pharmacy, with ample parking for anyone who wanted to avail themselves of these new conveniences. In fact, most of the people who occupied the long rows of solid houses that lined the blocks running west along the backside of the stores that occupied Main Street could just as easily walk to the new mall than up the gentle slope to the aging shops downtown. But then very few people bothered to walk much anymore. Everyone had a car nowadays, or at least everyone that mattered. The only thing about the town that seemed to remain constant was the high school. Tucked just a block over from the end of downtown opposite City Hall, it had been built at the conclusion of the First World War, and with the exception of the football field being laid out in the wide field between the single long school building and the drop-off down to the road that ran beside the tracks at the end of the Second World War, it had remained unchanged for almost 2 decades now. It seemed that no matter what else occurred in Drum's Crossroad, Beaumont High School would always remain a reminder of the heyday of the small community. But now even that was going to change, and in a most disturbing and unsettling way. 3 weeks ago, the state Supreme Court had made its final ruling on the single issue that had bubbled quietly under the surface of everyone's thoughts. In the entire collection of states that lay south of the Mason-Dixon line for some time now, it had been decreed and decided, and there would, no matter how much it bothered the residents of the small community, be no turning back. Beginning in September of this very year, Beaumont High School would be receiving, like it or not, its first black students. There were still details to be worked out, of course. Up until this point, the residents of Drum's Crossroad could go for days or weeks without ever seeing a black face. Not that there weren't members of that race living in the vicinity. There most certainly were, but they had their own places, their own shops, their own churches. In order to find them, one had to travel north from downtown, out the nondescript road toward the city dump, and bear to the right at the fork near the car dealership. Through the thick copse of trees and down the gentle slope on the plain dirt road that branched off at that point, tucked out of sight, was Walkertown, named after the owner of the plantation on whose property it had grown up, seemingly as a kind of dismissive afterthought. Lining that single stretch of beaten-down dirt were the grim wooden shacks in which most of the members of that race in the vicinity dwelt. These were not like the homes in which the white people expended their lives. These were plain, unpainted boxes, their surfaces long ago aged to a sickly gray beneath rusting tin roofs, and a bit further along the main road from where the ignorable dirt path led down to those carefully hidden eyesores, there were the few small crude buildings that stocked the barest necessities of life, which those sorts of people needed to survive. Out at the end of the jumble of crude structures, beyond a well-designed stand of tall pines intended to mask the crumbling hovels from its site, was the ramshackle big house of old Mr. Walker himself. For the past 40 years, this creaking, sagging remnant of a long-dead age of glory had served as the single schoolhouse for all those people's children from the time they were old enough to walk to it until, for the most part, they gave up trying to learn anything and took their place as just another one of the faceless, quiet, humble hired hands who took care of the most distasteful chores for the citizens of the quaint little town of Drum's Crossroads. But all that was going to change in September. Every day, one of the half-dozen yellow school buses that spent much of their time parked in the large lot beside Beaumont High would rumble out to that forgotten wilderness and return with 6 black faces. Those strange, disquieting creatures would sit in classrooms with decent white children and walk the polished hallways beside them, take seats in the cafeteria, and occupy space in the tiers of the wooden stands at the football field, and things would never be the same again. No doubt about it. Many people thought as they moved lazily along Main Street on that unseasonably warm spring afternoon. Things were going to change soon, unless someone did something about it. Laura leaned against the sink, her hands deep in the warm water, absently scrubbing at the big iron pot, her attention turned to the faint throbbing under her left eye. She flexed her cheek, opening her mouth and squinting her blue eyes, and although there was a sharp sting for a moment, and she could feel the swelling, she didn't think he'd broken her cheekbone. It would be sore for days, and she would have to apply extra makeup to try and mask the swelling she knew was sure to increase for a little while. But it wasn't broken. She knew what broken bones felt like all too well. That was one thing BJ had taught her. It would probably be bruised, an ugly dark mix of purple and blue. She'd long ago learned how to apply her makeup to cover the bruising, but the swelling was something she couldn't do much about, which meant she'd be stuck at home again for at least a few days while it slowly went down. She couldn't face the questions, the strange, piercing looks from passers-by, making her feel like some kind of oddity meant to be gawked at and whispered over. Not again, she thought. A curl of her long blonde hair swung down over her forehead, and she pulled her hand, still clutching the rusty dripping steel wool pad, out of the soapy sink water and brushed the back of it across her face. The wisp of hair just swung away as the wrist passed, and then flopped back, trailing down over her eye. It was such a simple, small thing, but that tiny extra bit of frustration was enough. She bent forward, bracing herself against the edge of the sink, and let the sobs come. She was 27 and married, and her life was a nightmare. Laura Dellinger had been the prettiest girl in Beaumont High School. Everybody had said so. She'd always been surrounded by friends. She'd been invited to all the parties, sought after by all the boys. With her long blonde hair, her blue eyes, and mature womanly figure, she had been the center around which so much of the social life of her class had revolved. And she'd been so sweet. People had liked her, genuinely liked her. Not just because she was pretty, but because she really cared about them and would always have time to talk to them and treat them like decent human beings. The only thing was, she knew she just wasn't terribly bright, but that was as it was, and she had long ago accepted it. She never really aspired to anything more than becoming a wife and mother, making a good life for her family and taking sense of accomplishment from that. That was what her own mother had done, and she'd been so happy. So when BJ had fixed his sights on her and asked her out to the dance after the homecoming game in their senior year, she had dared to allow herself a shimmering tingle of hope that her dreams, as simple as they were, might actually come true. He was so handsome back then, she remembered, and so admired. The coach had said many times he was the sole reason Beaumont High baseball team had made it to the statewide playoffs. During that winter, she'd spent many hours over at his family's farm, sitting in the ramshackle shop talking with him as he bent over the hood of some car and used his natural skill to bring it back from uselessness with bits and pieces he'd scavenged from the junkyard. He was so good with his hands in that way. And then had come that Saturday when it had gotten so cold and she'd sat shivering on that long bench among the tools. He told her to get into the car and pull the blanket up over herself if she wanted to, that he'd be finished installing the whatever it was in a little bit, and then they'd go into the house. And she'd done it, slipping into the front seat of the old sedan and swaddling herself in the soft folds of the blanket, feeling a sense of coziness and contentment. He'd left the hood up when he finally climbed into the driver's seat, turned to her with a warm grin and cranked over the engine, which rumbled, sputtered, and finally caught with a loud roar. She squealed with excitement. He was so good, so skilled. He made her glow with pride. And then their eyes had met and held for a long time. And she knew at that moment it was going to happen. Right there, right then, in the drafty old building, wrapped in a blanket in the front seat of that rusty old car on that cold Saturday morning. But she hadn't known that she'd wake up a few weeks later feeling sick and strange. And she hadn't known that when she told him he would react like he had, with such sudden, unexpected fury. It was her parents who had turned out to be the true nightmare. When she revealed her condition, they had erupted into a righteous rage that had terrified her and plunged her into a deep sadness. They called her whore, and much worse, until she erupted from the house in complete anguish. They had yelled after her never to return. She had not spoken to them since. But BJ did the right thing. He stood by her. And even though she'd hoped and prayed that everything would work out for them, it would be tough and trying, but it would still work out. And for a while, he actually seemed happy when they would snuggle down together into the large, soft bed, and he would touch her the way he did, and she would cling to him and feel him inside her. Then the cramps came, almost doubling her over when she stood behind the counter of the small clothing store right on Main Street, causing her to clutch her belly and gasp. Mrs. Johnson fluttered around her, alarmed and dismayed, and finally ordered her to go home. And that night the blood came, terrifying her, causing her to reach over and rouse him from the deep oblivion the beer had sent him to, and he'd managed to stumble out of bed and get dressed and get her to the hospital. And then there was no reason for them to be married anymore, except that they were. She never could figure out exactly, but that was probably that moment when BJ first started to turn mean. She stood leaning on the sink, the tears trickling down her cheeks, and she let them flow, not bothering to try and stop them, not attempting to deny them this time. It was the one thing she had left that she could rely on, the hurting, the pain. It let her know she was, at least, still alive. But after a while, that quiet sense of calm flooded over her, and she felt herself going numb once more. She glanced over at where the clock stood on top of the refrigerator, and a small shock of panic shot through her. Not much time. He'd be home soon. He'd walk in the door, tired, sore from bending over the hood of some car all day, his overalls covered in grease and dirt, a six-pack or paper bag clutched almost desperately in one hand, and she'd have just one look at his face to tell what kind of evening it would be. If his eyes sparkled, danced with the joy of some small accomplishment, it would be a good evening. They might actually talk and laugh again. He might reach out to her, pull her down into his lap and bury his face against her neck playfully. They might hold one another, or more. But if his eyes were dark when he walked in the door, she'd have another nightmare to endure. She glanced around quickly, feeling a sense of dread. Was the house all right? Would it meet his expectations, whatever they might be tonight? It wasn't much, she knew. Just a small cheap box stuck out on the far edge of town. It still needed so much work, and sometimes it was more than she could handle just keeping it straight and orderly, keeping the bugs out and trying to make the shabby furniture and faded wallpaper look halfway decent. But he expected it always to be just so. Especially he would sometimes growl at her with that grim, threatening tone. There were no damn rugrats to mess it up on her. She just never knew what he'd find fault with. Lord God, how she wanted it to stop. How she wanted him back the way he was, back before that cold Saturday. How she loved that memory and dreaded the shell of what was left. If only there were some way. Then she heard the sputtering rumble of the pickup, and she knew instantly it was going to be a bad night. It was too early. When things were bad, he always came home early. She gripped the edge of the sink, rigid and feeling the chill rush through her. Looking out through the small, dirty kitchen window, she saw the pickup come around the side of the house and ease to a stop, next to the old gnarled tree. When he stepped out, she could tell instantly that his expression was dark. It had been another bad day. Oh, God, she thought. Why? Why me? Why this life? The crickets laid their twittering song on the mid-afternoon gloom, calling from every corner of the shadows, filling the deepening grayness with a soft buzz. Sure does get still sometimes, Sammy John thought. Strange kind of still. He sat on the edge of the low, crude porch, his legs drawn up and firmly planted in their warm and dusty sneakers on the top step of the three that led from the patch at the ground that was the yard, his arms wrapped around his knees, staring out into the fading light of the day. But it'll rain tonight, he thought. He couldn't know for sure, of course, but there was a sense about the air and the gathering overcast that just felt like there were cats and dogs up there in the clouds, anxious to bust loose and come tumbling down. He thought quickly about whether or not there was anything on the chair in the corner of his small room at the back of the shack that might get wet if the roof should leak again, which it probably would, and whether he should get up right now, fetch the bucket from the kitchen and get ready for it. But he decided he'd be inside a little bit, and he could see to it then. For the moment he simply sat, drinking in the thickness of the air, feeling it bristle over his skin and trying to put his mind on something besides September. He just couldn't think about it anymore, or he'd start to go crazy. It was wonderful and terrifying, all mixed up in a single sack. He would celebrate his 17th birthday on the day before school started. He'd already checked the schedule in the local paper. That meant that he would be a junior and would qualify to try out for the varsity football team. And he could make it, he told himself. He was good enough, wasn't he? Certainly he was big enough. He'd been the biggest boy in his class over at the Walker School, ever since he'd started there in first grade. The other children had always looked up at him with a kind of awe that made him a little uncomfortable. But those who took the trouble to get to know him seemed to like him well enough. And they even listened to him and respected him when he'd step into the middle of some silly fight and make them quit. He was 16 and now stood as tall as a man, with broad shoulders and strong legs. In the last few years, Auntie Boo, who had taken him in so long ago he couldn't really remember it, had started to remark just how much he was beginning to remind her of her brother, his father. At first he questioned her about him, this man he'd never known, who had died when he was just a baby, leaving his mother to fend for them alone. But that always brought back the sad thoughts of when she met that man and went off with him, promising to send for him, which she never did. So now when Auntie Boo would shake her head and mutter that he was looking more and more the spitting image of his daddy, he would just smile and nod slightly and try to think of some other direction to turn the talk before she fell quiet, lost in that sadness that seemed to come over her more and more with each passing year. He raised a hand and ran it over his thick, tight, wiry hair. I should get that cut back, he thought. White folks don't seem to like it when black people let their hair grow too long, and it didn't make no never mind to him. He didn't much care about his hair, or his clothes, or anything, except football. He did dearly love football. All during the winter for the last few years, he would carefully track the progress of the professional teams, making note of the various player statistics, the team schedules, how they matched up against one another, and he had actually gotten pretty good at being able to predict who would win any individual contest on any given Sunday. That had become the one unpolluted joy of his life, football. And then that Christmas 4 years ago when Auntie Boo had gotten him that regulation size and weight football, which must have set her back a pretty penny, he almost broke down and cried. And that was when the passion had turned into an obsession. Almost every day since, he had spent part of each afternoon, from the time he got home from school until it was too dark to see, tossing that football through the worn tire that hung by the long rope from the branch of the withered tree at the corner of the lot. At first it was frustrating, watching it flop end over end and fall to the ground nowhere near where he wanted it to wind up. But after a while, he learned how to grip it so that he could get it to fly like a fat leather bullet, spiraling straight as an arrow, cutting through the tire with almost equal clearance on all sides. And when he would get bored with that range, he'd back up another few steps and start all over, until he'd mastered that distance as well. Finally, he took to giving it a good hard push, and then dropping back as if he'd just been hiked the ball, and finally shooting it straight through the twisting, spinning pendulum of rubber more times than not. Nowadays, he could stand clear across the road, must be 60 or 70 yards off, and at least get it to hit the tire, if not plunge straight into the hole, though the steepness of the angle might make it bounce straight back out, rather than send it through. But he was hitting it, more or less, just about every time. And lately he'd even begun practicing throwing it while running, bobbing and darting around the yard, managing to get it through the hole 9 times out of 10. But Sammy John knew he'd have to be able to do a lot more than just throw the ball in order to actually get to play. He'd have to be able to run, not just fast, but cut corners and dance out of the reach of other players intent on bringing him crashing down. So he'd gotten into a whole routine whenever he set himself for his private little practices. He would fire the ball and immediately drop into a crouching stance, the knuckles of his left hand pressed into the dirt, then spring off like a jackrabbit and race to try and reach the ball before it stopped rolling its wobbly way along the ground on the far side of the tire. When he first started, he could almost make it, scooping it up out of the dirt just as it came to rest. Now, though, he was so far away from the target such a thing was just impossible, but still he'd blast towards it as fast as he could. After all, he wasn't just playing anymore. He was training. At first, the folks in the little shacks along the dusty road used to stop when they'd see him and watch, sometimes turning away with a confused and weary shake of the head at what they must have taken as his strange behavior. But nowadays, some of them, especially the men, would stand and just watch for a bit, as if they were actually interested and impressed at what he was doing. It was too bad, he thought, that there weren't more boys his own age or size close enough to get together a good pickup game. Oh, he'd enjoy playing with them now and again on a lazy Saturday, and actually liked the feeling of being the quarterback, giving the commands, making up the plays, and having an actual catcher to throw at. But those games were just casual fun for the others, and he needed something more than that. He needed to be around those who understood that football wasn't just something to do on a long, boring weekend. Football was important. It mattered in a way he couldn't quite explain to anyone. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a movement down the street, and without turning to look, shoved his attention at it, like tipping a room and having all the furniture go crashing suddenly against one wall. That was something else a good football player had to be able to do, he understood. Be able to pay attention to the corners of his eyes and understand what was going on there, quickly and accurately. It was Fly. He knew instantly. The tall, skinny boy who had been his best friend, on and off, since he could remember, shuffling toward him from his own small home down at the end of the dusty road. He liked Fly. Of all the boys he'd known in his short life, Fly was the only one who stuck by him no matter what. When the novelty of whiling away an afternoon tossing the football around began to wear off with other boys, Fly stuck around, joining him in long sessions of just tossing the pigskin back and forth. And despite the fact that Fly never did seem to figure out how to pitch it with any power or accuracy, that was almost all the better, since it allowed Sammy John to practice darting instantly to try and snag it out of the air before it touched the ground. Most days, by the time the sun finally faded out, leaving them squinting in the dim glare of the porch light, Sammy John was winded and sweating, while Fly was just as fresh as he'd arrived, having put little more into the activity than was necessary to get the ball in the vague vicinity of where Sammy John was standing. "Hey, Sammy John," Fly called out from the corner of the yard, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jeans. "Hey, Fly," Sammy called back, not bothering to turn in his direction. "What's up, man?" "Nothing." Sammy grunted as Fly ambled to the steps, turned and dropped his lanky frame beside him. "I hear that," Fly said with a sigh, crossing his arms over his gangly knees and settling his chin on them. They sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the beginning cool of the evening settle over them. Sammy let his eyes drift up, noticed the clouds flowing in from the west, heavy with rain. The air was thick with growing moisture. There would be no tossing the ball around this day, he thought. "What's the matter, man?" Fly asked, looking over at his friend from the corners of his eyes. Sammy shrugged. "Nothing," he muttered. "Shit," Fly drawled, a thin smile playing out over his lips. "You gonna be best quarterback they ever had, man. They gonna kiss your black ass." Sammy grunted, his gaze fixed on the quickly darkening sky. "Cheerleaders gonna be all over you," Fly added with a smug grunt. "You gonna be a star." Fly turned to look at him, his gaze narrowing. "What's wrong, man?" he said, his voice suddenly low and wary. "I don't know," Sammy replied quietly, "but something's coming." "What?" Slowly Sammy shook his head, his eyes never leaving the thickening layer of clouds forming over them. "I don't know. Something." Fly turned his own gaze to the sky, feeling a thread of chill along his spine. "Something bad," Sammy added. Fly stared up at the cheerless gray clouds and felt a sudden shiver ripple through him. He shrugged it off, standing suddenly. "Come on," he said. "Let's go do something." Sammy kept his gaze fixed on the sky for a few more moments. Somewhere inside himself he could feel a hollowness that was uncomfortable and almost sad. He knew that no matter how good he was at throwing the football, no matter how good he was at anything, he would still have to face the dark looks and muttered insults that would be tossed at him from the white kids when he invaded their territory when school started once more. It wasn't something he was looking forward to. He just wanted to play football. He wondered if there was really any possibility that they would allow that. Allow a nigger to play on their team, no matter how good he turned out to be. "Come on," Fly whined, shifting restlessly, turning to look down the street. "Let's go do something, man." Sammy turned to look up at where his friend stood, all lanky bones and eyes. Fly hadn't been chosen as one of the few to be transferred to the white school. Fly was going to spend another year in the cramped, dirty little room that served as his class at Walker. That meant that Sammy wouldn't know anybody over there. He'd be completely alone. Only a dozen of the Walker students, ranging from the 3rd grade up, had been selected to make the move. That was probably the very least number that would have been acceptable to the judges and lawyers, and all those folks who made the law about having to desegregate the schools throughout the state. There had been screaming fits in the newspapers and on TV about it ever since it was announced more than a year ago. The white folks had protested and complained and threatened just as hard as they were able, but in the end they seemed to see that it wasn't any use. So now they had just gone quiet and sulky, like children who knew they weren't going to be getting ice cream they'd been expecting. That was really what bothered Sammy more than anything else. That quiet. He'd spent his whole life being called all manner of names and learning the careful business of walking softly through a world that seemed to be owned by white people. At least when they were angry, when they shouted and cursed, you could always do something, even if it was just to run away as fast as you were able. But to have them merely stare at you with those cold eyes when you walked by, that was something you couldn't do anything about. And Sammy never knew when or if they might suddenly decide they'd had enough of his flaunting himself in their faces. They might just boil away, not saying a word, getting hotter and hotter, and he'd never know it. It might get to be too much for them to stand, and they might just snap, just like that, and there'd be no way he would know it was about to happen. In a way he almost hoped they'd curse him when he first got there, curse him and stand in his way, and knock his books out of his hands and laugh at him. At least that way he'd be able to do something. He'd be able to show them that no matter what they did, he was there to stay, that he wouldn't strike back, wouldn't bend to making any trouble, that he would take whatever they chose to do because if he could, maybe he would show them that they didn't have any reason to hate him. "Hey, man," Fly said, concern in his voice. Sammy flinched, pulling himself back from his drifting thoughts. He focused on his skinny friend now standing, awkward and uncomfortable, close by on the graying boards of the porch steps. "You okay, man?" Sammy merely nodded, flicked his eyes up to the clouds, noted that they were thickening steadily, and rose slowly. "I'm fine," he said quietly. "Let's go do something." Fly's face split in a wide grin, his back straightening slightly, his lanky muscles infusing with the beginnings of excitement. "All right," he said warmly. Sammy turned to look at the house, wondering for a fleeting moment if he should go get a jacket or something. It was sure to start raining in a little while. Instead, he merely stepped off the low stair into the dirt of the yard, moving off across it toward the street in a lazy amble. They'd just wander, he knew, letting the restlessness burn its way out of them in lazy, ambling steps. Fly hopped down into the dusty ground beside him, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his worn, faded blue jeans. The two boys moved off from the house, going nowhere in particular, not even bothering to trot back to the porch for the football that rested in the wooden box beside the front door. This would not be an afternoon of tense muscles and fiery activity. This would be a time for young men to keep each other company, as they silently pondered the weighty questions of life, with the seriousness only such a breed can obtain. As they reached the street, they could hear the approaching vehicle, and made sure they clung to the pitted and broken edge of the pavement. Sammy John turned his head to glance back at the vehicle that approached them and instantly recognized it. It was Mr. Maurice's old battered pickup. As it drew near, he absently pulled his hand from his pocket and tossed off a casual wave, the pickup beginning to slow down as he pulled even with the two boys. "Hey, Mr. Washington," Fly called, taking a step toward the vehicle. "Hey, Fly," Maurice acknowledged. "You going to be able to help me out tomorrow?" Fly's expression seemed to brighten at the prospect of earning a few dollars by helping the older man with whatever job he was currently engaged in. "Sure thing, Mr. Washington," Maurice nodded. "Come on over around 8, he said simply. "Yes, sir," Fly said, giving a nod. Maurice returned the nod and turned his gaze to where Sammy John stood watching. "How you doing, Sammy John?" he asked. "Doing fine, sir," Sammy said, adding his own nod to the conversation. "All right, then," Maurice added. "I'll see you in the morning, Fly." "Yes, sir," Fly concluded. as Maurice gently pushed on the gas pedal and the pickup engine ground up, pulling the pickup along past them as if it was battling against almost more weight than it could bear, leaving a faint bluish cloud of acrid smoke in its wake as it headed along the road that wound through the patches of scattered woods toward town, only a few miles ahead. "So?" Fly said at last. "What you want to do, man?" Sammy John shrugged. "Don't know. Nothing." They moved along in silence for a few paces before Fly again broke the stillness of the heavy air. "Hey, Sammy." "Yeah?" "You scared, ain't you? 'Bout school?" Sammy shrugged, trying to appear casual, but feeling the restlessness welling up in his chest. But it wasn't necessary to reply. This was not a question meant to be answered. It was only to let a friend know his apprehensions were understood and shared. Fly set his face hard, his eyes fixed ahead. "Anybody mess with you, gonna have to mess with me too, man. Damn straight." Sammy couldn't help but feel the smile curl the corners of his mouth. Fly was about as fearsome as a dry stick, but he was warmed by the feeling behind the words. "Thanks, man," he said gently. Fly bobbed his head as if to punctuate his offer and his apparent acceptance, and straightened his shoulders. A few steps further, he yanked a hand from the pocket of his jeans and gave Sammy's arm a light flick. "Hey, come on, man," he said, his voice growing excited. "Try to catch me. Come on, football star." He broke into a jog, lurching ahead of where Sammy was walking down the road, turning back to face him even as he jogged backwards, increasing the distance between them. "Come on, man. Your auntie run faster than that." Sammy dropped his head and shook it, feeling the smile widen. "Okay," he thought, "if that's what you want." With startling speed, he leaned into his next step, legs suddenly pumping, body surging forward, already setting a hard run even as the first foot struck the black pavement. Fly's eyes snapped wide, almost comically. "Oh, shit," he muttered, whirling in place, and shot out at full speed, a tangle of gangly limbs. The boys ran until their breath bellowed in tight panting, and the laughter boiled up, and there was nothing in the world but the day and the running, and for a little while it was good to be alive.